December 1944. The snow falls heavy over the Ardennes. The temperature hovers near zero. American soldiers are dying by the thousands in what will become the bloodiest battle. The United States Army fights in all of World War II, and somewhere in Luxembourg, a general stands alone in a freezing chapel, on his knees, praying to God for 4 days of clear weather. His name is George S. Patton. In just 72 hours, he will attempt something that every general in the room thinks is impossible. Something that even Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest military mind of the 19th century, never accomplished. And after the war, when the German generals are captured and interrogated, one of them will say something extraordinary about this American. He will say that Patton didn't just match Napoleon, he improved on him. This is the story of what Patton did in those frozen December days that made his enemies speak of him in the same breath as history's greatest commanders. If you're fascinated by the moments when history hangs in the balance, when one man's decision changes everything, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Now let's get back to December 1944. To understand why what Patton did was so remarkable, you need to know 3 things about the situation in December 1944. First, the Allied High Command was completely blindsided. Adolf Hitler had secretly assembled 3 armies, over 200,000 men, and more than 1,000 tanks, right under the noses of Allied intelligence. On December 16th, these forces burst out of the fog and snow, through the weakly defended Ardennes forest, catching everyone off guard. Second, the weather was absolutely brutal. A thick blanket of fog and snow grounded all Allied aircraft, which meant the most powerful air force in the world was useless. The Germans could move freely, knowing they wouldn't be bombed or strafed from above. And third, the crossroads town of Bastogne had become the focal point of the entire battle. 7 main roads converged there. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could push straight through to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in 2, and potentially change the course of the entire war in Europe. By December 20th, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded there, running low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. They were holding on by their fingernails, and everyone knew it. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the man the Army turned to in this desperate hour. George Smith Patton Jr. was not born to be ordinary. He came into this world on November 11, 1885, into a wealthy California family with deep roots in Virginia's military aristocracy. His grandfather and great-uncle had both died fighting for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and young George grew up on stories of their valor. But here's the thing that most people don't know about Patton. The man who would become one of America's most fearsome generals had a secret that haunted him his entire life. He couldn't read until he was 11 years old. What historians now believe was severe dyslexia made his early education a humiliating struggle. At West Point, where he had to repeat his first year because of poor grades, he would later write to his father, "I am either very lazy or very stupid or both, for it is beastly hard for me to learn." Think about that. The man who would one day outthink and outmaneuver some of the best military minds in Germany spent his youth believing he might be stupid. But Patton turned that struggle into fuel. He became obsessed with proving himself, with earning glory, with becoming a warrior so fierce that no one would ever doubt his worth again. He studied military history voraciously, memorizing the campaigns of Frederick the Great, Napoleon, and the ancient Greeks. He designed a new cavalry saber for the army. He competed in the 1912 Olympics in the modern pentathlon. He was the first American officer assigned to the tank corps in World War I, and personally led his tanks into battle, getting shot through the thigh by a machine gun and lying in a shell hole for hours before he would allow himself to be evacuated. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man who believed he was destined for greatness, and who spent every moment of his life preparing for it. His men called him Old Blood and Guts, and Patton cultivated that image deliberately. He wore polished cavalry boots, an ivory-handled revolver, and a scowl that his biographers say he practiced in the mirror. But beneath all that swagger was a man driven by deep insecurities and an almost desperate need to prove that he was worthy of the legends he had grown up worshipping. By December 1944, George Patton was 59 years old, commanding the Third Army and itching for a fight. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the sky along the Ardennes front lit up with the flash of 2,000 German artillery pieces. The shells came screaming down on American positions that were thinly held, manned by green divisions that had never seen combat, and battle-worn divisions that had been sent there to rest. Within hours, the German offensive had punched a hole in the American line, 50 miles wide. Panzer divisions poured through the gap like water through a burst dam. The American commanders were stunned. For months they had been told the Germans were finished, that the war would be over by Christmas. Now German tanks were rolling west toward the Meuse River, and whole American units were being surrounded and destroyed. The situation at Bastogne crystallized the crisis. The 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, had been rushed there from a rest area in France, arriving just ahead of the Germans. By December 20th, they were completely surrounded. No supplies could get in. No wounded could get out. The division's only hospital was the floor of a local riding academy, and they were running out of medical supplies. The weather made everything worse. Temperatures dropped below zero. Frostbite claimed almost as many casualties as German bullets, and the fog and snow kept the Allied planes on the ground, day after day after day. On December 22nd, the Germans sent officers forward under a white flag with an ultimatum: surrender or face total annihilation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defense of Bastogne, in the absence of the 101st's commander, received the message and gave what would become one of the most famous replies in military history. When his aide asked what to tell the Germans, McAuliffe said simply, "Nuts." That one-word response captured the defiant spirit of the defenders, but defiance alone wouldn't save them. By that point, the 101st had 3 days of ammunition left. Some units were down to their last few rounds. Everyone knew that without relief, Bastogne would fall, and if Bastogne fell, the entire southern shoulder of the Allied line could collapse. Meanwhile, at Supreme Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower was scrambling to respond. He needed to stabilize the northern shoulder of the Bulge, reinforce the defenders of Bastogne, and somehow counterattack into the southern flank of the German penetration. The question was, who could move fast enough? Which commander had troops in position and the audacity to attack into a German offensive that had already chewed up several American divisions? Eisenhower called an emergency meeting for December 19th at Verdun, France. He needed a miracle. What he got was George Patton. The meeting room at Verdun on December 19, 1944, was freezing cold. 16 officers, British and American, sat hunched in their coats, cigarette and cigar smoke filling the air. A large map of the Western Front dominated one wall, and on that map the situation looked grim. The German penetration had created what newspapers would call the Bulge, a dangerous salient that threatened to split the Allied armies. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words that surprised everyone in the room. "The present situation," he said, "is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." One of the officers smoking a cigar was George Patton. His Third Army was currently positioned south of the Bulge, engaged in fighting near the German border, preparing for an offensive toward Frankfurt. Everything his army had been planning for was about to be thrown out the window. Patton knew what was coming, and he was ready. In fact, he'd been ready for days. Here's what most people at that meeting didn't know. While other commanders had been caught completely off guard by the German offensive, Patton had been watching the intelligence reports for weeks. He had noticed that the Germans had been strangely quiet in the Ardennes sector. He had seen signs of troop movements that others had dismissed. On November 25th, he had written in his diary that the First Army was making a terrible mistake, leaving its forces static in the Ardennes. He suspected the Germans were building up for something big. So Patton had done something that no other Allied commander had done. Before the meeting at Verdun, before Eisenhower even asked him for help, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for a massive pivot northward. Each plan had a code name. Cent called for an attack north through Diekirch. Nickel called for an attack from Arlon toward Bastogne. Dime would hit the tip of the Bulge, wherever that might be. His deputy, Major General Hobart Gay, was waiting in Nancy, with a telephone, ready to execute whichever plan Eisenhower chose. When Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked how long it would take him to disengage from his current operations, turn his entire army 90 degrees, and attack northward into the German flank, Patton gave an answer that made some of the British officers laugh out loud. 48 hours, he said. A British general scoffed. You couldn't turn an army that fast. Eisenhower himself was skeptical. "Don't be fatuous, George," he warned. "If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready." But Patton held his ground. He knew something the others didn't. His army was already moving. Think about what Patton was proposing. The Third Army consisted of over 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, supply trucks, ambulances, and all the equipment needed to support a modern army in combat. They were spread across a front dozens of miles wide, engaged with the enemy, and facing east toward Germany. Patton was saying he could turn all of it 90 degrees and attack north in winter over damaged roads through hostile territory in just 2 days. Military historians would later note that this was the kind of maneuver that would normally require at least a week of planning and preparation. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of rapid maneuver, had never attempted anything quite like it. But Patton had prepared. He had studied the terrain. He had positioned his supply depots. He had briefed his subordinate commanders. When Eisenhower finally gave his approval, Patton stepped out of the room, found a telephone, and called Hobart Gay. He gave him a single word: nickel. The attack on Bastogne was on. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We cover history's most dramatic moments, the decisions that changed everything, the men who made them. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Now let's see if Patton could actually pull this off. The moment Patton hung up that telephone, the Third Army began to move. Picture it. Columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry stretched across miles of frozen roads, all pivoting like some massive industrial ballet, wheeling north toward Bastogne. The weather was brutal. Ice covered the roads. Snow fell constantly. Vehicles slid into ditches. Engines froze. Men suffered frostbite even inside their tanks. And yet they moved, hour after hour, day after day, covering ground that should have taken a week in less than 3. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division. His unit would become the spearhead of Patton's relief force. Abrams was tough, aggressive, and exactly the kind of officer Patton loved. Years later, the Army would name its main battle tank after him. But in December 1944, he was just a young battalion commander with a desperate mission: break through to Bastogne before it was too late. The 4th Armored had been in combat almost continuously since August. They had fought across France, liberated towns, and taken casualties that depleted their ranks. Now they were being asked to do the impossible. Starting on December 22nd, the 3 combat commands of the 4th Armored Division battled their way north toward Bastogne. Every village was a fight. German troops had fortified the roads with anti-tank guns, dug in infantry and tank destroyers. The weather that had kept Allied aircraft grounded began to break on December 23rd, and Patton, who had written his own prayer asking God for 4 days of clear weather, watched as American P-47 Thunderbolts finally took to the skies. They hammered German positions, strafed columns on the roads, and gave the advancing Americans some desperately needed air support. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the 37th Tank Battalion made its final push. By now they were down to just 20 medium tanks. Abrams and his fellow commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Jacques of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, could see C-47 transport planes dropping supplies over Bastogne. In the distance, they knew they were close. Abrams suggested a direct dash through the village of Eisenhower, straight into Bastogne. It was risky, but speed was everything now. Leading the column was a Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess. It was an M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, an assault variant with extra armor. At Eisenhower, American artillery rained down over 2,000 shells on the German defenders. Then Boggess and his crew charged forward, their guns blazing, spraying machine gun fire into the woods on both sides of the road. 4 Shermans were knocked out in the attack, but Cobra King pushed through. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Boggess spotted American soldiers in the woods near a pillbox. They were wearing American uniforms, but German infiltrators had been dressing as Americans. So Boggess was cautious. Then one of the men walked up to the tank, stuck out his hand, and said, "Glad to see you." They were engineers from the 101st Airborne. The siege of Bastogne was broken. At 5:10 p.m., Abrams shook hands with General McAuliffe. Patton had delivered on his impossible promise. In just 6 days, he had turned an army, marched it over 100 miles, in the worst weather in European memory, broken through German defenses, and relieved one of the most important positions in the entire battle. It was a feat of logistics, leadership, and sheer willpower that stunned military observers around the world. The relief of Bastogne didn't end the Battle of the Bulge. The fighting would continue for another 3 weeks, and the casualties would mount into the tens of thousands. But Patton's dramatic maneuver had broken the back of the German offensive. By holding Bastogne and then relieving it, the Americans had denied the Germans the road network they needed to exploit their initial breakthrough. The great gamble that Hitler had staked everything on was doomed. What Patton had accomplished did not go unnoticed by the Germans. After the war, when senior Wehrmacht officers were captured and interrogated by Allied intelligence, many of them were asked about the American commanders they had faced. One name came up again and again: Patton. General Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall German commander in the West, gave a remarkable assessment. He said that the Germans regarded Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of all the Allies, the one whose operations impressed them most. And then Blumentritt said something extraordinary. He came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet: activity, speed, and more speed. Think about what that means. A German general, trained in the traditions of Frederick the Great and the Prussian military establishment, a man who had helped plan some of Germany's most successful campaigns, was saying that this American had surpassed Napoleon. Napoleon, whose campaigns were studied in every military academy in the world. Napoleon, whose name was synonymous with military genius. The Germans, who believed themselves to be the masters of mobile warfare, were saying that Patton had beaten them at their own game. For the men who had frozen and bled their way to Bastogne, it was validation of the highest order. And for George Patton, the boy who couldn't read until he was 11, the cadet who had to repeat his first year at West Point, it was the glory he had spent his entire life pursuing. He had proven once and for all that he belonged in the company of history's great commanders. There's something deeply human about this story that goes beyond military strategy. George Patton spent his whole life preparing for moments like this. He read everything he could about the great commanders of history. He trained his body and mind relentlessly. He cultivated an image of invincibility, even when he was plagued by doubts. And when his moment came, when everything was on the line, he was ready. How many of us prepare like that for the challenges we know are coming? How many of us do the work before the crisis hits, so that when everyone else is scrambling to react, we can already be in motion? Patton wasn't lucky at Bastogne. He was prepared. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The thing that separated Patton from the other generals in that cold room at Verdun wasn't just courage or aggression. It was the fact that while everyone else was seeing the German offensive as a disaster, Patton had already been thinking about it for weeks. He had already done the planning. He had already positioned his pieces on the board. When the moment came, all he had to say was one word: nickel. If this story moved you, if it made you think about preparation, leadership, and rising to impossible challenges, then you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these videos for. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss another episode. We've got more incredible stories coming. Stories about the moments when history was made by people who refused to accept that something couldn't be done. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.